Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sports Lock Podcast. I am your host, Ben Mosteller, and tonight we have the 2023 NFC East Divisional Preview. We're going to talk about some breaking news first out of the NFL with regards to Ezekiel Elliott as well as Dalvin Cook before we get into the divisional previews. And this week, we're going to have a bonus episode. This episode is supposed to come out last week, but instead, this upcoming week, we will have tonight the NFC East, Thursday the NFC West, and then early on next week we will get to my rankings, busts, and sleepers podcast, which is one you won't want to miss to help you prepare for your draft. We're already 2 weeks done with the preseason, one more to go, and then the start of the NFL season coming up on September 7th. But let's not waste much more time here. Let's jump right into it and talk about the top news in the NFL, and the AFC East is adding top running backs. Ezekiel Elliott signed a deal with the Patriots, and Dalvin Cook signed a deal with the Jets. Now, this impacts two top guys that were probably right around top 15 running backs in the NFL, and that would be Breece Hall and Ramondre Stevenson. So for Ramondre Stevenson, he was my RB9 after having a stellar season last year. And although they had Harris as the starter for a little bit, and then when Ramondre took over, Harris is not Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott's going to have more of an impact than Harris had. So I am moving him the whole way down to my RB18. I think he's going to drop a round or two, in my opinion. Still a talented back. He's still listed as the starter, and Elliott is the backup. But I think Elliott will get a lot more goal line work, which, as Ramondre Stevenson took more of that work last year from Harris. So he's my RB18 now. ESPN moved him to RB15. Ezekiel Elliott's my RB40. ESPN has him at RB48. So Ezekiel Elliott's no longer going to be a stud that you draft in the first two rounds. He's a backup, but he's still going to have some significant playing time there in New England. So again, Ramondre Stevenson now my RB18. He was my RB9. Now we'll move on to Dalvin Cook, a huge signing for the Jets. Now, Breece Hall is coming off of an injury, so Dalvin Cook is going to get some early work. And right now, they do have him listed as the backup to Hall, but I do believe that Cook will take over the backfield at some point. He's just that star player, and I think that's somebody that Aaron Rodgers wants to play with more than Breece Hall. So this one's going to be a little bit more difficult because of a situation, just because of the Breece Hall injury. I think Dalvin Cook takes over a much bigger workload. And we look at Cook over his years, and especially last year, finished as the RB11 in Minnesota with over 1,100 rushing yards and 10 total touchdowns. Now, Breece Hall was my RB14. I had him a little bit higher earlier, but he continues to fall. One, because of the injury, and two, because of now Dalvin Cook. So now he's my RB27. ESPN doesn't have him that bad. They have him as RB21. But Dalvin Cook is my RB20, kind of reversing roles here. ESPN has him as the RB27. So I'm a lot higher on Dalvin Cook than most people are. They're saying still go Breece Hall. I'm saying go Dalvin Cook, mainly because of the injury. So this is some interesting news, and also some other breaking news just coming out the other day. Jonathan Taylor is seeking a trade. That's why I always do my ranking sleepers and busts the last week after we see preseason, what people have done there, and also after we see what's going to happen before the start of the season. By then, we hope to see if Josh Jacobs will be back reporting to camp, and I guess going to play in week 1. He hasn't been to camp yet. And also, we're going to take a look at the Jonathan Taylor news. So a lot of news that could break from now to the start of the season. That's why you want to check out my sleepers and busts and my rankings next week to check out where everybody lands. But let's jump to the Dallas Cowboys now to start off the NFC East divisional preview. Last year, they finished second in the division with an impressive 12-5 record. This was also their second year in a row getting to 12-5. And what did they do in the draft in the offseason? Well, they signed quarterback Stephon Gilmore from Indianapolis, and they also got wide receiver Brandon Cooks from the Texans. They went off and drafted two guys from Michigan back to back. In the first round, they went and got defensive tackle Maisie Smith. And in the second round, they got tight end Luke Schoonmaker, who will probably play a role as a starter, the tight end position. Let's talk about quarterback Dak Prescott. Dak finished QB 18 last year with 2,860 yards passing, 23 touchdowns, and 15 interceptions, which was the most amongst starting quarterbacks last year in the NFL. This was in 12 games, and he was on pace to finish right around the QB 12 if he was healthy. Now, Dak hasn't been impressive in camp. From what I've seen so far, he's been throwing a lot of picks, and that's very concerning to me. And ESPN currently has him ranked at QB 10. He does have some upside there to get around the QB 10, but I'm more conservative on Dak this season because of the injuries last year and because of the bad news out of camp. He does add Brandon Cooks, which is great for him to go along with CeeDee Lamb, but you lose a top tight end. You also lose out on Ezekiel Elliott. I know he has Tony Pollard, who's incredible, but there are some downgrades here, in my opinion, on this team, and Dak being one of them. I don't think he's the same Dak that we're used to. So I'm not thrilled with him this year. He's not a guy that I really want to land on my team. At this point, he's my QB 13. Again, ESPN QB 10. But I just feel like when you get to this point in the draft, if you're looking at him to either be a starter or a backup, you want to go with a guy with more upside, in my opinion. And there's guys like Tua down there. Anthony Richardson's kind of a little bit further down, but there's more guys with upside, even Kenny Pickett, from what we've seen out of the preseason, that I would rather kind of take a risk on there. So Dak's a guy that I'm avoiding, but he is my QB 13. Tony Pollard. Now, Tony Pollard should be a stud this year. He finished as the RB8 even with Ezekiel Elliott last season, and he was behind Zeke. He was still able to run for over 1,000 yards, and he had 12 total touchdowns. In the 4 games that he started, and in the last, he started 4 games, and in the last 3, he had 337 yards and 6 touchdowns in his last 3 games that he started. So Pollard could easily go off and be a top 5 running back. That's where I have him at RB5. He's more valuable in non-PPR than PPR. But he's still a top running back that you want. In PPR, even, he's still my RB5, ESPN RB6. So if you're able to snag Tony Pollard in the second round and pair him with a top wide receiver, like a Tyreek Hill, or even another running back right in that position, like a Saquon Barkley, and you have 2 studs there, that's something that you're looking to do. But I preferably would go wide receiver like Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, and then snag Tony Pollard. It'll be a dynamic duo there. We have to talk about the wide receivers now. CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, and Michael Gallup. Lamb finishes the wide receiver 5 last year with 107 receptions, which was 4th best amongst wide receivers. 1,359 yards, which was 6th best amongst wide receivers. And he had 9 total touchdowns, which was tied 3rd amongst wide receivers. Brandon Cooks finishes a wide receiver 49, 57 receptions, just under 700 yards receiving, and 3 touchdowns. Michael Gallup had 39 receptions, 424 yards, and 4 touchdowns for wide receiver 65. Now, Lamb's still going to be the main guy, and I think that he should at least get 1,200 receiving yards. I think that's kind of a floor for him. He's my wide receiver 7, same with ESPN. I think that he has potential again to be a top 5 wide receiver. I just feel like other guys are going to step up in that spot. You have Cooper Kupp returning and some other big names right around there, like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, that could potentially finish just in front of him. But I think wide receiver 7 is a good spot for CeeDee Lamb. Now, Brandon Cooks should receive a slight uptick in touchdowns. Last year, only 3. I think he gets to around 5. I agree with ESPN at wide receiver 37. Finally, Michael Gallup is my wide receiver 53, ESPN wide receiver 54. Now, the tight end is right now listed as Jake Ferguson, but they did go out and spend that 2nd round pick on the tight end out of Michigan. But right now, Ferguson was a rookie last year. He didn't play much. This season, I really don't expect much either, even if it's Shoemaker or if it's Ferguson. He's my tight end 35, ESPN tight end 33. And finally, the defense, they were number 2 last year in fantasy. Phenomenal defense, looking to do great again this year. That is a pro for them. They have a very great defense carrying them. led by Micah Parsons. But what are some of the cons? I think is Dak pretty much. Can Dak bounce back? Can he stay healthy? Because if not, I think this team will struggle. Last year they were 12-5. I projected 11-6. This year I'm right around 12-5, 11-6. But I'm going to lean more 12-5 because if everybody's healthy and with that defense, this team again can easily go and contend for the division. We're going to go to the New York Giants next, who finished third in the division with a 9-7-1 record. This was their best season since 2016. Now, what did they do in the offseason? They signed Jamison Crowder from the Jets. They signed wide receiver Paris Campbell from the Colts, wide receiver Cole Beasley from the Buccaneers. They went out and got running back James Robinson from the Jets. And then they also signed, in my opinion, was their best signing, tight end Darren Waller to replace Evan Ingram there in New York. What did they do in the draft? Well, they drafted cornerback Deontay Banks out of Maryland and wide receiver Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee in the third round. Quarterback Daniel Jones, he finishes the QB9 last year, 3,200 yards, 15 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. The real value for him came with his legs in the running game, 708 yards, which was fifth best amongst quarterbacks, and 7 touchdowns, which was tied for third amongst quarterbacks. Now this year, Jones again had a sensational year, but it was a record year for his legs. I think those rushing numbers come down, not a lot, but I don't see him getting to 7 touchdowns quite, and maybe 500 to 600 yards rushing. I think he's going to try to throw the ball a little bit more. With that being said, I don't think he hits QB9, but I do like him at QB12. I like him a little bit more than Dak Prescott this season. I just think that he's been more reliable, and he has that rushing ability that Dak doesn't have. So at any point, he can take off with his legs. That's why he's a tick ahead of Dak Prescott. Saquon Barkley, who has been a stud besides injury concerns. When he plays, he's incredible. He finished last year as the RB5, and he rushed for 1,300 yards, which was 4th best amongst running backs, and had 10 touchdowns, which was 5th best. And he also had 57 receptions, but only for 338 yards. So a lot of receiving work, but he didn't break it off for any touchdowns or big gains. So what's he going to do this year? I think he is obviously the best player on this Giants team. And I believe that he'll have similar numbers to last year. I think he'll possibly do even better. I think you have to add in a few receiving touchdowns. And with that being said, he's my RB3. ESPN has him as the RB4. Right now, he's flip-flopped with Bijan Robinson. Robinson, I have a lot further down the list as being a rookie. I think Saquon's a lot safer as the RB3 this season. Now, the wide receivers aren't very exciting, but there are a couple guys that I like, mainly the top guy, Isaiah Hodgins, Darius Slayton, and Paris Campbell. These are a lot of guys that you can get very, very late in drafts. Let's first start with Paris Campbell, though, as he performed the best last year in fantasy. He finished as the wide receiver 48, 63 receptions, 623 yards, 3 touchdowns. Darius Slayton was right behind him, 3 spots lower, 46 receptions, 724 yards, 2 touchdowns. Now, Isaiah Hodgins, in my opinion, is a more valuable play. In only 8 games, he had 33 receptions, 351 yards, and 4 touchdowns. So he already had 1 more touchdown than the rest of the group, and not too many less receptions, especially from Slayton. So Hodgins is the guy that I would want out of this Giants backfield. I know a lot of people are aiming at Paris Campbell, but I really would aim for Isaiah Hodgins. He's going undrafted in most leagues, and he's 195th, I believe, on ESPN. If you can grab him very late in the last round or even a waiver wire pickup, Hodgins could easily go off for 8 touchdowns this season. I am monitoring very closely, and I'm also trying to get him with one of my last picks in drafts. He's my wide receiver 62, but I easily think he could crack the top 50 at least. ESPN has him as wide receiver 73. Slayton and Campbell, they could go undrafted. I think, again, a lot of people will aim at Campbell first, but what I'm seeing out of the preseason so far is that Isaiah Hodgins is the guy that they like. Now, another guy that I like and could be kind of a sleeper as a tight end this year is Darren Waller. He's coming in from the Raiders, where he only played in 9 games last year, but he's been a top fantasy tight end in years past. This year, you could arguably say that he's a quarterback upgrade, and he's been getting a lot of looks in camp so far. They really like him. In the last preseason game, he had 2 catches, I believe. He looks really good. He's my tight end 5, ESPN tight end 4. I think when you slip past a couple of the top guys, it is just so even from, I would say, tight end 4, 5 to like tight end 12. Any of those guys could easily finish in any order there, and you're not wrong with going with any of them. So as I always say, if you're not landing on the big 3 this year, and my big 3, of course, would be TJ Hawkinson, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, not in that order. But if you don't land on one of those guys, or even George Kittle, you could throw in there. I would say wait. I would wait on a tight end, because the difference between a Darren Waller and a Pat Freiermuth might only be a few points, but it could be within a few rounds of each other. So tight end, I'm waiting on if I don't land on the top 3, top 4 guys. Their defense is average, maybe a little bit below average, but they drafted to try to help that out. And one of the pros is that Saquon is back healthy with a new contract. There was a chance that he might sit out some games, but he got his contract. He's ready to play. A con is that it's just a tough division, and they have a tough schedule. So last year they go 9-7-1. I projected 3-14. I was extremely low on the Giants. I'm sorry, New York. But this year I'm going 6-11. I think they do finish below 500. I do think they have potential to finish right around where they did last year, but I see at the max maybe 8 to 9 wins. But conservatively, I'm going to say they go 6-11. Now let's jump to the division winners of last season, and that was the Philadelphia. Yeah, the Philadelphia Eagles at 14-3 was their best record in history. They went on, of course, to lose the Super Bowl to the Kansas City Chiefs, but they're bringing a lot of top guys back. But first, let's take a look at their offseason moves. They signed running back Rashad Penny from Seattle. They also got DeAndre Swift in a trade with Detroit. They signed quarterback Marcus Mariota from Atlanta and wide receiver Olamide Zaccheaus out of Atlanta as well. They went on to draft 2 Georgia players back-to-back in the first round. With the 9th pick, they got Jalen Carter, the defensive tackle. And with the last pick in the first round, they went out and got outside linebacker Nolan Smith. So let's talk about Jalen Hurts. Last year, 3,701 yards, 22 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. But kind of like Daniel Jones, he contributed in the running game, 760 yards, which was 4th best amongst quarterbacks. And he led quarterbacks with the most rushing touchdowns with 13. Now, I see Hurts throwing the ball a little bit more this season, and I think that's going to cut into those rushing touchdowns. I don't see it being 13, but somewhere conservatively around 8 or 9. With that being said, though, I still think he finishes as the QB3. I think he is consensus QB3 for me. I think arguably Allen or Mahomes is going to be 1 or 2. I'm leaning more Mahomes, especially what I saw out of Allen in the first preseason game that he played against the Steelers. But I like Jalen Hurts to finish back at QB3 again, at least in the top 5. The guy's got talent. He has amazing weapons around him, which we'll talk about in a minute. And he's a guy that if the top 2 slide to you, I'd be happy taking Hurts at 3. Now, the running back situation is up in the air in Philadelphia. Right now, DeAndre Swift is listed as the RB1, but Kenneth Gainwell, who's listed as the RB3, has been getting the most work in camp out of all of these running backs. Now, Swift last year, an impressive RB20, 542 yards and 8 total touchdowns. And that was along with Williams getting a lot more touchdowns than that, pretty much double of what Swift got. So still performed extremely well. In my opinion, I would kind of stay away from the backfield, but at the ADP, I'd rather have Gainwell to take the risk on. Right now, he's going as the RB51. I moved him up to my RB46. Swift is going as RB33. He's my RB32. So I think Swift still has value. He's not going to be anywhere near RB20. And I do think they start the season as Swift, but I think that Swift and Gainwell will split a lot of time. And at the ADP, again, I would rather take a guy later on like Gainwell than a guy like Swift because of the potential upside so far that we're seeing in camp. Now, the wide receivers, A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, both had incredible seasons, finishing in the top 10 in fantasy. Brown was a little bit better as a wide receiver 6. He did have 7 less receptions than Smith with 88, but he had just under 1,500 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns, which was tied second amongst wide receivers. Smith finished as the wide receiver 9, so 3 spots down. Again, 7 more receptions, but had exactly 300 less receiving yards and 4 less touchdowns. So what do I think about this season? Well, I think Smith and Brown are still going to put up similar numbers. Maybe Brown doesn't get quite to 11 touchdowns, but I do think he gets right around 85 to 90 receptions again. With that being said, I would slightly rather have Brown. I just think he's a better guy, but either guy works. They're going around the same ADP. If you take away 3 touchdowns from Brown and almost 200 yards last season, he would have only finished 1 spot worse. So that's how good he was. And again, if we're taking away saying he has 800 and I'm sorry, not 800, but if he has about 200 less yards and 3 less touchdowns to 8 touchdowns is what I meant to say, you're looking at still being a top 10 wide receiver, which is more where I think he's going to be. So for me, it's my wide receiver 9. I think he drops a couple spots again, and other guys step up. I think Garrett Wilson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, guys like that. But he's my wide receiver 9, ESPN wide receiver 10, and I'm a little bit higher on Devonta Smith. He's my wide receiver 11. I think I have Jalen Waddle or somebody right in between there. Could be Garrett Wilson, but ESPN has him as my wide receiver, as their wide receiver 15. I did take away some receptions from Smith, but I still think 7 touchdowns is very generous. I think that's a good baseline, and I think the yards are about the same as well. And we skipped over Dallas Goedert, but Dallas Goedert, I believe, will be a top 10 tight end. I think that he finishes around tight end 9 is where I had him. So you didn't miss much on the last screen, but right around tight end 9 for me. I think ESPN might be a spot or 2 higher. Now, the defense was 4th overall, so they were just as good last year as the Cowboys. The pros are that they have a great returning team. You have Hurts, you have your wide receivers, you have Goddard, and you have a great defense. But the cons are that they have a little bit tougher of a schedule. And 14-3 is incredible. Again, that was their best record in history. So I don't think they hit that. I think they go more of 12-5. They tie with the Cowboys, but they get the tiebreaker to win the division. Lastly, we have the Washington Commanders, who finished 8-1, which was last in the division. And this was their best season since 2016. Now, in the draft, they really focused a lot on defense. That is where they're good at. So the biggest thing was they got cornerback Emmanuel Forbes from Mississippi State with the 16th overall pick. Nothing really too fantasy relevant in the draft or the offseason for these Commanders. But we have to talk about a guy they drafted 5th in the 5th round last year, and quarterback Sam Howell, who started 1 game last year. He threw 169 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Not too terrible for your first game. He's looked good in preseason so far as well. He's been named the starter. So I think he could be a sleeper to finish in the top 20. I'm not going to say he's going to be like QB 15, but I think right around the top 20. So 19, 20, right around that mark he will. I'm putting him at QB 23, though. ESPN has him at QB 29, but definitely a guy that has some good weapons in McLaurin and Dotson around him, and also a good receiving back, who we'll talk about in a second, in Antonio Gibson. So Sam Howell doesn't have a terrible team around him. Not exciting, but I think he does have some potential as a sleeper. So we talk about Brian Robinson first because he is listed as a starter. He finished as the RB39 last year, 797 yards and 3 total touchdowns starting in 9 games. Antonio Gibson did finish better than him at RB25, but only had 546 rushing yards. But this is where he came in clutch: 46 receptions, 353 yards, and 2 touchdowns. and 6 games started. So he did very well there. So I think they're going to use both backs. I'd kind of stay away from both. But if you are wanting to pick one, I would say PPR, you go with Antonio Gibson, and non-PPR, you go with Brian Robinson Jr. Right now, ESPN and I are very similar on our rankings. I have Gibson as my RB35, so does ESPN. And Robinson is going as the RB34 on ESPN. I have him one spot below Gibson at RB36 just because of the receiving upside for Gibson. Wide receivers Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. McLaurin finished as the wide receiver 14 last year, 77 receptions, almost 1,200 yards and 5 touchdowns. Jahan Dotson came on hot late, 7 total touchdowns last year coming towards the end of the season, 35 receptions, 523 yards, and he did have a little bit of an injury. So this season, Dotson is a guy you want. Dotson has a huge ceiling. I think Dotson could finish in the top 25 as a wide receiver, whereas McLaurin, I think, takes a drop. I don't see him getting around 77 receptions. I think more about 65 with the new quarterback, maybe just over 1,000 yards, not almost 1,200. And the touchdowns are probably about accurate. Dotson, maybe take away a touchdown from him, but I do think he sees almost double of the receptions that he did last year. And he's been connecting so far with Howell in camp and in preseason. And with McLaurin's foot injury, Dotson has huge upside. Dotson for me is my wide receiver 32, ESPN wide receiver 39. I still have McLaurin ahead of him at the wide receiver 29. For me, ESPN's wide receiver 27, but I don't see him being anywhere near the top 15. Lastly, Logan Thomas at the tight end has been very injury prone, finished as a tight end 31 last year, only 1 touchdown. I don't really see too much for him this year. I do think that he'll have at least 2 or 3 touchdowns. That's why I moved him up to my tight end 27 spot. ESPN is at his tight end 26. That's an error on the screen. It should be tight end 26, not wide receiver 26. That would be incredible for Logan Thomas, though. Their defense is right around the top 10, which is what carries them. That's a pro, but the cons are that they have a new quarterback taking over that offense, and we don't know how they're going to do. Carson Wentz last year was much better than Sam Howell. So I do think that they fall a little bit, especially with the record. Last year, they were 8-1. I projected 6-11. This year, I think they go 4-13. I did have them 3-14, but I do think their defense will help them win another close game to get them to 4-13. Now, I've been doing my best teams of the division. And again, this isn't saying that they're sleepers or bust for me overall, but they could be. But this is just what they are for the division. So if you're drafting the best NFC East team, Jalen Hurts obviously is your quarterback, Saquon Barkley is your running back, CeeDee Lamb is your wide receiver, and the tight end is Darren Waller for me. Sleepers would be quarterback Sam Howell. Hopefully he gives them hell. Sam Howell, I definitely think, has a chance to finish closer to QB 20 than QB 30, which is right around where ESPN has him. Running back Kenneth Gainwell, like I said, what I've heard and what I've seen out of camp is that he's been getting more first team reps than DeAndre Swift and Rashad Penny. Wide receiver Jahan Dotson, again, I just think his upside is amazing. 7 touchdowns last year. He already has a better connection with Sam Howell, it appears, in the preseason and in camp. I really like Dotson. And the tight end Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles, out of all the tight ends, thinks he is a sleeper. I think he could finish closer to the top 5 than he does the top 10. Bust quarterback Dak Prescott. I do think he's a bust with his injury concerns, the lack of rushing ability, and 15 interceptions last season. I really don't have him as high as ESPN does. By the time I do my rankings, he could drop another spot or 2. I do think that he finishes right around QB 13 or 15 and not inside the top 10 like ESPN is about projecting him. I also think DeAndre Swift could be a bust at his ADP just because of the unknown at the running back position in Philadelphia. And when you have a guy like Jalen Hurts, who's a running quarterback, compared to a guy like Jared Goff that DeAndre Swift had last year in Detroit, there's a big difference. There won't be as many reps for DeAndre Swift. Wide receiver Terry McLaurin is going to be a bust for me just because of this foot injury last year. Wide receiver 14. I do think that Dotson has potential to take over as the wide receiver 1 there, especially with that connection so far with Howell. And then I'm going to say that tight end Logan Thomas is a bust just at the ADP. We take a look at all the other guys, Waller, Goddard, they're very good with tight ends. And we take a look at the other two. I already am very low on the Dallas tight ends. So we're going with Logan Thomas as a bust. As the standings pan out in the NFC East this year, I like the Eagles and Cowboys at 12-5, but given the nod to the Eagles to win the division, I think there's a better chance that they get to 13 games to win and a better chance that the Cowboys only get 11. That's why I have them ahead as well. Giants at 6-11 and the Commanders at 4-13. That's the podcast for you guys. Thanks for listening in, and thanks for the support so far. We've had a pretty good amount of views on these videos. And again, I am sorry that this one wasn't out last week, but we're going to do a double week video, the NFC East, obviously tonight. And if you're watching as it comes out or the day after, this upcoming Thursday, just 2 days later, we're going to release the NFC West podcast to finish out the divisional previews. That way, next week early on, I will be able to put out my sleepers, rankings, and bust podcast for you guys, which is a very important one as well. If you're not subscribed already on YouTube, make sure you do so. And if you're not following me on other platforms, make sure to follow Sports Log Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Once again, thank you guys for listening in. We are getting very close to the start of the NFL season and fantasy football. I'm excited for it myself. And I hope you take the time to support the channel, as I'll be putting out more videos coming here soon and throughout the season. Hopefully you guys enjoy your evening, and I'll see you guys just in a couple days with the next podcast, the last of the divisional preview, the NFC West.